I live in a rainforest here. And I had friends visiting me, and we were walking through the forest, and there were these berries. And I was eating them off the bush. I think they were salmon berries, but it doesn't matter. But my friend wouldn't eat one. And she's like, I don't trust nature. And that has been the conditioning that we've been sold over our lifetime is trust what you get in the supermarket. It's great, but don't trust what you'll find in the woods. And granted, there are some things in the woods for sure that are poisonous and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
But we trust the supermarket where very few of us know what is happening to our food before it arrives there. So I thought it was an interesting experience, just how we've been conditioned to trust something other than nature. And I loved how you said war with nature. We turned into a space of where we're at war with nature. Why do you think we've been turned to be at war with nature in the 1950s?
Um, I in some ways, try to put myself into the place of uh, well, actually, I just want to backtrack for a second. So, hunter gatherer tribes will find within a quarter mile of most of the places that they settle between 1,600 plants that are edible, and like we have absolutely no idea. So in many ways, I understand when people walk through nature, and what they see is potential harm. Um, we there is there is enough conditioning that happens within a media landscape that sells lots of fear. Um, you know, we only hear about the people who accidentally poison themselves with, say, mushrooms that look like, you know, uh, any number of different things. And most of it is because primarily we're incompetent, right? A hunter gatherer has the ability to go and produce its own food, its own clothing, its own shelter. They have done that for millions of years. There's probably one in a million people alive on this planet today in Western culture who could probably do those things themselves as well. Um, so to get back to your question, I want to say the production volume that happened in the 1950s had one the exuberance of the sort of chemical era, right? And so you have this thing where it's like you start to understand what you believe that nature is, and you start to pull all of these different dynamics from nature, and you say that you can control this environment in many myriad different ways. And so humans had this illusion of control going forward. Whereas I think if you look at a lot of the posters in media, the world fairs, the way that we talked about what technology was going to do for us, even in the early 2000s, the assumption was that we would be living in these perfect landscapes of these like space age towers. And if you look at a lot of that stuff, what you never see in there is nature, right? You see these like environments that are completely antiseptic, where maybe you have flying cars around or jetpacks or whatever. So the irrational exuberance of the 1950s said that we are starting to learn enough that we can control and dominate nature, and the best way to do that was through the same things that we were using for war. Um, and we actually talk about this a lot. Kate, who you had on this podcast, we were talking a lot about recently. And sorry, this is a small tangent, but I think it's actually a really good parable. We've been talking a lot about phosphate mining. It's weird, like in order to grow food, you need three basic elements. You need nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. And so nitrogen is abundant in the atmosphere. It's our atmosphere is predominantly nitrogen, but most of it is inert. You have to be able to activate it in order to grow plants. And there's a few ways that you can do that. We use legumes, the bacteria that grows on the root systems of the legumes. will pair and activate the nitrogen in the air and actually share that with other plants that surround them. So that we started to understand in early 1906. Potassium is fairly abundant. Phosphorus is this weird element where we've known for actually a very long time that it limits the growth of everything on this planet. There is a finite amount. Once you exceed that amount, there is no more. We can't produce it. It's a strange element. And so for us, phosphorus became this sort of metaphor that we constantly talk about because you need this to grow, right? You absolutely need this to grow. And yet in World War II, we created these phosphorus bombs and we would light entire cities on fire with them. Because once you take that phosphorus, distill it down, and make something they call elemental phosphorus, it just burns. It burns until it will go out. So you could take these things that are fundamental life and use them as killing weapons, and we did the same thing with nitrogen. A lot of the bombs that were produced in World War I and World War II were the basic elements of that were nitrogen. So we have this sort of weird duality that kind of happens in our world where we take these things that are absolutely integral to life and we use it as killing machines. And so I think they reversed it in the 1950s. They said, all right, well, we're going to take these killing machines, these perfect elements for killing, and we're going to convert that into making life. But you can also take a lot of those elements and use those for pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. And so it's just a sort of like stranger element of our world. And I think in some ways it's the way that you view science. A lot of people now are trying to reconcile themselves with that war with nature and see how they can commune with nature more to understand all of the elements of that, because we know that we're losing the war. So if you take phosphorus or if you take nitrogen, you take that abundance, you put it onto land to grow food. If it washes into our water systems, it does what it's supposed to do, and it builds all of this algae blooms that we've seen, where you see green rivers and then you see dead zones all the way down in the Gulf of Mexico. So those algae will bloom in the way that our plants will in agriculture. They'll bloom. They take all of the oxygen out of that water, and then all the fish die. All of the life that dies around there. So all of these different elements are integral to life, but in excess or used in the wrong way can actually be the perfect lethal sort of killing machines. And so like when we talk about it, when I walk through a supermarket now, what I experience on a regular basis is awe, right? Because I'm just total awe at like the sheer abundance of what I see right in front of me. But also just terror because the amount of like death required for everything that you see in there, in order to feed ourselves is what we've done. We've terraformed this planet to feed ourselves. And so for us, it's just a weird mix of emotions that we're constantly going through. So the 1950s was this sort of pivotal moment, I think, in many different ways. And what we did was I think up until the 1970s, we have produced enough food for a growing population almost every single year since the 1970s. So even last year and the year before, we produced enough food to feed about 10 billion people, right? So we produce enormous amount of abundance of food. Now, why are people starving? It's a question that we should always be constantly asking ourselves, because we produce enough food, even going up until 2050, we produce enough calories every year to be able to feed a growing population of people. And a lot of that is political. A lot of it is, feed one person a day, but then you're feeding them 365 days out of the year. And they're just a whole different element of just myriad different policies and bureaucracies and profit motives and everything like that that's associated with. But So yeah, I think it's for me, it's the awe of we produce so many calories. It's absolutely insane how many calories we produce. Um, and terror, because I think once you realize the ecological cost to all of that, you start to realize that we're really drawing down on a lot of the checks and balances that naturally occur within nature, that allow for that's why we're seeing dead zones. That's why we're seeing species, extinctions. That's why we're seeing all of these different things.
Yeah.